When my stepsister showed up at the family barbecue wearing my designer coat and told everyone I had gifted it to her, I didn't know yet that I would one day take back absolutely everything. The coat was a camel-colored wool blend I had bought myself after my first real promotion. I had saved for it. Not the way people say they save for something and mean 2 weeks of skipping coffee. I mean 8 months of watching the price online, checking the tag in the store 3 separate times, and finally buying it on a Tuesday in November because I needed to feel like I had done something right that year. It had my initials sewn inside on a small fabric label. NC. 2 letters on a piece of white ribbon, stitched in navy thread. Brielle never noticed it. She wore the coat like it was hers from the beginning. That was how it always worked with Brielle Sutton. She was 27. I was 29. We had been step-siblings since I was 12 and she was 10, when my mother married her father, and we all moved into the same house in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon. By the time we were adults, Brielle had developed a very specific talent. She could take something that belonged to you, use it in front of you, and make you feel like you were the unreasonable one for minding. The Christmas before the barbecue, she had shown up to the family dinner in my rust-colored cable knit sweater. The one I kept on a specific shelf in my closet because it stretched if you hung it. My Aunt Eleanor had admired it immediately. She asked Brielle where she found something so nice. Brielle had laughed. That specific laugh she had, low and easy, like she was letting you in on something. She said, "Naomi and I share everything. It's just how we are." My aunt looked at me. I smiled. I picked up my glass of sparkling cider and I drank half of it in one go because it was something to do with my hands. That was the pattern. Brielle would do something. Then she would say something that made it sound like we had an arrangement. And then everyone around us would look at me to see if I was going to contradict her. And I never did. Not because I agreed, but because the cost of disagreeing in that house, at that table, with those people watching, was always higher than the cost of staying quiet. And the silence would pass, and the evening would continue, and the thing she had taken would stay taken, and by the next morning it would already be part of the furniture of our shared life in a way that felt too settled to undo. Before the barbecue there had been the garden tools. Brielle had opened the back of her Honda in front of Mrs. Patterson and 2 people I barely knew from the neighborhood association, and she had shown them the set of aluminum-handled trowels and shears my stepfather had given me for my 20th birthday. I gardened. Not seriously, but I had a corner of the side yard where I grew tomatoes in the summer and rosemary that came back every year without being asked. The tools had my name written in permanent marker on the handle of the largest trowel. Brielle had said, "Naomi said I could borrow them for the season." Mrs. Patterson had said how nice, sisters who share. I had been standing 12 feet away filling a cooler with ice. My friend Dana was the first one to say it out loud. We had been friends since our junior year of college, and she had the quality I most envied in people, which was the ability to name a thing directly without softening it first. One afternoon, she sent me a screenshot. It was a post on Brielle's social media. Brielle was at some outdoor market, laughing with someone I didn't recognize, and over her shoulder you could clearly see my brown leather tote bag. The one with the small brass clasp that I had bought in a secondhand shop in the Pearl District for more than I should have spent on a secondhand anything. The clasp had a tiny dent in it from when I had dropped it once on the sidewalk. You could see the dent in the photo if you knew to look for it. Dana's message said only, "Is that your bag?" I went home that evening and asked Brielle about it. Not accusingly. I had learned by then that accusing Brielle of anything in that house was like trying to pick up water with your hands. She would move around it. Brielle said the bag had been sitting in my room, and she needed something for the market, and she didn't think I'd care. She said it like she was slightly confused by the question. I went to my mother. I told her what had happened. My mother listened. Then she said, "You're not using it right now, are you?" That was when I understood that my mother was not going to be the person who helped me here. She wasn't cruel about it. She just had a way of looking at conflict and seeing inconvenience instead of injustice. She smoothed things over. She had been smoothing things over for 17 years, and somewhere in that smoothing she had decided that my silence and Brielle's taking were 2 parts of the same arrangement, and that the arrangement worked fine. The barbecue in June was the moment that something shifted in me, though I didn't show it. Brielle had arrived late, which she always did, in the coat. the camel code. She had walked directly to Mrs. Patterson from next door and said she had just gotten it as a gift from her sister. Mrs. Patterson had touched the sleeve and said it was beautiful. Brielle had smiled and said she knew. Wasn't Naomi so generous? I was standing 6 feet away holding a plate of potato salad. Our neighbor Mr. Donnelly came over later, once things had settled, and he made a comment to Brielle about how lucky she was to have such a generous sister. Brielle had looked at me then, with this expression that was almost fond, and said, "Naomi never objects to anything. She's too good for that." Mr. Donnelly laughed. He thought it was a compliment. I looked at the fence at the edge of the yard. There was a gap between 2 boards where the wood had warped over the winter, and someone had stuffed a piece of orange plastic netting into it as a temporary fix. I stared at that orange netting for a moment. Then I put another piece of watermelon on my plate. Later that evening, before I went to bed, I opened my closet door and looked at the key hanging on the hook inside. It was an old brass key, the kind with a round bow and a simple rectangular bit. It opened the lock on my bedroom door. A lock I had asked my stepfather to install when I was 16, after the 3rd time Brielle had gone through my things while I was at school. He had installed it, reluctantly, and had said while he was doing it that he hoped this wouldn't become a habit. Then he had handed me the key, and that was the end of the conversation. The joke in the house ever since had been that I was the only one who needed a key to her own room. The joke had been going for 11 years, and I had never once thought it was funny. Brielle thought the joke was very funny. She said it regularly. She would say, "What's the point of the key? I can still get in if I want to." She meant it to sound like warmth. Like closeness. Like we were so close that locks were a formality, like the very existence of the key was slightly absurd between people who shared everything. But the thing about a joke that you repeat for 11 years is that eventually it stops being a joke and becomes a statement. I turned the key over in my hand. Then I hung it back on the hook and went to bed. The day everything changed was a Tuesday in September. I had left work early because a vendor meeting had been canceled at the last minute, and I had come home to an empty house, or what I thought was an empty house. My mother and stepfather were at some home improvement store across town. Brielle's car was in the driveway, but she often left it there when she got rides with friends. I walked past the hallway bathroom, past the linen closet, and as I passed the open door of Brielle's room I stopped. Not because I was looking. Because the light from her window fell in a particular angle and caught the screen of her tablet, which was propped open on her unmade bed, and the screen was bright enough to read from the doorway. She had Facebook Marketplace open. I stepped closer. I didn't touch anything. I just read. The listing said, "Selling furniture from my room. Need space. Great condition." There were 4 photographs attached to the listing. The first was of a small wooden side table I had never seen before. The second was of my grandmother's lamp. She had given it to me the Christmas I turned 19, wrapped in brown paper and twine, which was how she wrapped everything. She had said, "This was in my first apartment, now it's yours." She died 2 years later. The lamp was the only thing of hers I had. The third photograph was of my bookshelf, the tall one with the scallop edge at the top that I had painted white myself over a single long weekend 2 summers ago. The fourth was of my writing desk. I knew that desk from every angle. I had bought it at an estate sale in Beaverton for $60 and had spent 2 months refinishing the top. There was a scratch near the left corner where I had set down a mug of coffee without a coaster one night during finals week in my last year of college. I had been annoyed about that scratch for years. I could see it clearly in the photograph. There was an open message thread beneath the listing. Someone named M. Harrington had written, "Can I pick up the desk Saturday?" And Brielle had replied, "Yes, morning works, I can do 10 a.m. It was Wednesday. The pickup was in 3 days. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 45 seconds. Then I walked to my own room, sat on the edge of my bed, and did not do anything dramatic. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat there in the quiet afternoon of that house, and I understood something very clearly. The problem was never going to get better on its own. The problem was going to keep moving in one direction, and if I didn't move first, I was going to lose everything in pieces without anyone ever calling it what it was. I opened my laptop. I started a new browser window. I looked up apartments in Seattle. I want to say there was a dramatic moment when I made the decision. But it wasn't like that. It was more like the decision had already been made somewhere underneath everything, and I was just now looking at it directly. Seattle, because I had been in contact with a recruiter there for 3 months. Seattle, because it was close enough to feel possible and far enough to feel like a beginning. I did not say anything to Brielle about the listing. I went downstairs and made dinner and sat at the table and listened to my mother talk about whether to repaint the front door, and I smiled in the right places. When Brielle came home later, I said hello and asked how her day was. She said fine. Then she said, "You've been weird lately. You okay?" I said I was tired. By the end of the following week, I had a job offer from a company called Carver and Associates in Seattle. Project manager. 32% more than I was earning in Portland. I signed the contract at my desk at work and put the folder in my bag. My manager, Marjorie Fields, came by around 4 o'clock. Marjorie was the kind of person who had an opinion about everything and was usually right, which made her exhausting and also invaluable. She carried a bright yellow legal pad everywhere she went, even to meetings where she wasn't presenting, even to lunch. She wrote things down constantly. She had written down the name of the dry cleaner that had done a good job on her winter coat. She had written down the exact phrasing of a compliment someone had given her in 2019. She said it was how she remembered that things were real. She stopped at my desk and looked at the folder. She said, "Is that the Seattle paperwork?" I said yes. She sat down across from me and said, "Is this about the situation at home?" I had told Marjorie some of it over the 18 months I had worked for her. She had a way of asking questions that made you answer more than you planned to. She had once said something I had thought about more than I expected. She had said, "People tell you who they are. Believe them the first time." I hadn't said anything when she said it, but I had written it down on a post-it note and stuck it inside my desk drawer, and I had looked at it enough times that the ink had started to fade at the edges. I told her yes. Marjorie opened her yellow pad and wrote something down. She didn't tell me what. Then she closed it and said, "Stop trying to argue with the evidence. Start preparing. There's a difference." She got up and went back to her office. I sat at my desk for a few minutes after she left. Outside the window, the afternoon light was the particular flat gray of Portland in October, the kind of sky that looked the same at 2 o'clock as it did at 5. I had been looking at that sky from that window for a year and a half. I thought about the lamp on the marketplace listing, sitting in a photograph on a stranger's phone screen, tagged with a price and a neighborhood and a Saturday morning. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting on the card she had tucked under the twine. I had kept the card. I had kept everything. I put the folder in my bag and started answering emails. That night I started photographing my belongings. Gradually, over 2 weeks, so that nothing looked different from the outside. I photographed the lamp, the desk, the bookshelf, the set of ceramic mixing bowls my aunt had given me 3 years ago, the small rug in front of my closet that I had bought at a market in Eugene. I photographed each item from 3 angles. I photographed the serial numbers on the electronics. I photographed the receipts and warranty cards I kept in a folder at the back of my closet, organized by category. Furniture. Electronics. Kitchen. Miscellaneous. I had kept those documents for years without knowing exactly why, the way you keep certain things because something in you understands that ownership is not always obvious to other people and sometimes you have to prove it. I started keeping the folder in my work bag. I found an apartment in Seattle on a street called Birchwood, on the 4th floor of a building with big windows and a small balcony that faced east. I signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop near my office and texted no one about it. Brielle kept asking questions. She asked them in a way that sounded like concern but felt like surveillance. She would come into the kitchen while I was making breakfast and say, "You seem distracted. Are you sure you're okay?" She said it the way you say something when you're actually asking a different question entirely. Once she knocked on my door in the evening and asked directly if I was planning to move. I said I didn't know yet. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You'd tell me first, right? You wouldn't just disappear." I said I wouldn't just disappear. I ordered the moving truck for October 14th. The movers would arrive at 7 in the morning. I had a second appointment at 3 in the afternoon in Seattle to get the keys to the Birchwood apartment. Brielle did not know about the movers. She did not know about Seattle. She did not know about any of it. What she did know was that my mother's birthday was October 14th and that there would be a party. My mother's birthday parties were always the same format. Afternoon at the house, with whatever combination of family and neighbors had been invited that year. Someone brought a spiral-cut ham. Someone else brought a sheet cake from the grocery store. My stepfather made his lemonade with too much sugar. It was not an unpleasant tradition. It was just a tradition that I was going to attend for the last time. The party that year had maybe 20 people. My Aunt Elaine had come up from Medford, which she only did twice a year. The Donnellys from next door. A few of my mother's friends from her book club. Some cousins I saw every couple of years. People who had watched Brielle and me grow up in that house, who had complimented Brielle's outfits at a dozen dinners without knowing whose they were, who had laughed at the joke about the key without knowing what the key meant. I moved through the party like I had moved through every other event in that house for 17 years. I refilled the lemonade pitcher. I admired Mrs. Patterson's new earrings. I said happy birthday to my mother and watched her smile the smile she used for parties, wider than her regular smile, held 2 beats longer. I put things on plates I didn't eat. I was very good at being present without being there. I had been at the party for about an hour when the moving truck pulled up outside. I had timed it this way deliberately. Not to make a scene. To be surrounded by witnesses. The 2 movers, Carl and his partner whose name I never caught, came to the door and introduced themselves politely. Carl had a clipboard. He confirmed the inventory. I walked him through the house to my room. Brielle was outside on the patio when they started carrying things out through the front door. She came inside when she saw them. She said, "What is this?" She said it in a light voice, almost amused, like she expected me to tell her it was a misunderstanding. I said, "I'm moving." She laughed. She said, "This is a bit dramatic, isn't it? What's the performance about?" Then Carl carried out the tall bookshelf. The white one with the scalloped edge. Brielle watched him carry it to the truck, and her expression changed. She said, "Wait, that's from the living room." I said it had been in my room for 7 years. She said, "But everyone uses that." Carl came back for the writing desk. He had the dolly positioned correctly, and he was very efficient about it. Brielle stepped in front of him. She put her hand on the desk. She said, "This needs to stay." Carl looked at me. I looked at Brielle. I walked to the kitchen and came back with a folder. I set it on the kitchen island, which was where most of the party had migrated, because people always find their way to the kitchen. My Aunt Elaine was standing closest to the folder. She picked it up without asking, which was very Elaine. She opened it. Inside were the receipts, the photographs, the warranty cards, and the bank statements showing each purchase. Everything in chronological order, going back 8 years. The desk had been purchased in April of the year I was 22, at the estate sale in Beaverton, paid in cash, receipt included. The lamp had been purchased by my grandmother and given to me at Christmas when I was 19. I had a photograph of her handing it to me, printed on regular paper, folded in thirds, tucked behind the receipt from the electrician who had rewired it 2 years later. The photograph was small and slightly overexposed, and in it she was laughing at something off camera. I had kept that photograph because it was proof of the moment. But also because it was her laughing, and I did not have many of those, and now the lamp was going to stay where it belonged and Harrington was going to have to find a different desk. Elaine held up the receipt for the lamp. She said, "Hold on. Naomi bought this." She said it quietly. Not dramatic. Just a fact she was checking. My stepfather had come in from the backyard. He took the folder from Elaine and started going through it slowly, page by page. He didn't say anything for a while. He had always been a quiet man. His silence in moments of conflict had always bothered me because I could never tell if it meant he agreed with what was happening or if it meant he had simply decided not to get involved. That ambiguity had given Brielle years of room to operate in. But now he was reading. Turning each page. Actually reading the dates and the amounts and the names. Mr. Donnelly had followed him inside. He looked at the desk, still half in the hallway with Carl waiting behind it, And then he looked at Brielle, and he said, "So all of this was hers the whole time?" He said it without any particular judgment. Just a man updating his understanding of a situation. Brielle said, "I used those things. They were in shared spaces." My stepfather looked up from the folder. She said, "The desk was in a hallway." I did not say this. I let the folder speak. Brielle said, "But I used them." I said, "Yes, you did." She looked at me. She was waiting for more. There was nothing more. My mother had been standing in the kitchen doorway the whole time. I don't know how long. She said my name once, quietly. I looked at her. She had an expression I didn't have a word for. Not guilt exactly. More like someone who has just understood the ending of a story they thought they already knew. She opened her mouth once and closed it again. Then she looked away. Carl came back with the dolly for the desk. Brielle stepped aside. She did it slowly, like she wasn't sure she was doing it, but she did it. Carl navigated the desk out the front door with the efficiency of someone who moved furniture for a living and had seen all varieties of family situations and had no interest in any of them. He kept putting the small inventory stickers on each item as he loaded it, calm and methodical, while my aunt was still going through the receipts and my stepfather was standing in the middle of the kitchen reading a warranty card for a set of mixing bowls. Brielle said, "This is too much. You're making a point and the point has been made." I was putting the extra copies of the inventory back into my bag. I said, "I'm not making a point. I'm moving." She said, "You're embarrassing yourself." I said, "Okay." She said, "In front of the whole family, Naomi. Is this really who you want to be?" I zipped my bag. I looked at her. She had our mother's coloring and a way of setting her jaw when she was losing an argument that I had been watching for 17 years. It had never once occurred to her that I might simply leave. I said, "I'll be out by noon." I went back to my room to get the last of the boxes. Carl and his partner were done by 11:45. I did a final walkthrough of my room. The walls had squares of slightly brighter paint where my pictures had hung, clean rectangles where the color hadn't faded. The floor had indentations in the carpet from the desk legs, for small squares pressed into the pile after 7 years. I looked at those marks for a moment. Then I picked up the small brass key from the hook inside my closet. I had not forgotten it. I had left it for last. I went downstairs. Most of the party guests had left or drifted to the backyard to give the impression of not watching what was happening. My mother was in the kitchen washing dishes, which she did when she was upset and didn't want to talk. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She didn't turn around. She was washing a plate that was already clean. I knew that because I had seen her do it before at other times when something had happened that she couldn't fix and wouldn't name. She would wash the same dish twice and call it useful. I understood that this was her goodbye. The running water. The set of her shoulders. I let it be what it was. My stepfather handed me the folder back and said he hoped the new city would be good to me. He shook my hand. It was the most formal gesture he had ever made toward me, and somehow that made me think better of him than I had in a long time. Brielle was in the living room. She didn't look at me when I came through. I said goodbye. She said, "You'll regret this." Not meanly. More like a prediction she had already decided was true. I got in my car and drove north. I thought about Brielle's face when Carl carried out the bookshelf. The way her certainty cracked for a moment before she reassembled it into something that looked like outrage. She had lived so long inside a story where I was the generous one and she was the grateful one, where my silence was proof of my goodness, that the moment I stopped being silent she had no story left. She had tried to reach for the next available one, the one where I was embarrassing myself, where I was making a point, where I was being dramatic. But the folder was on the island. The receipts were dated. The inventory stickers were going onto the boxes one by one. You can't argue with a receipt. You can only stand in the kitchen and repeat I used them, and wait for that to become enough. It never became enough. It was never going to. I crossed the Columbia River just after noon. The water was gray and wide below the bridge. I had 3 hours of road ahead of me and a key waiting at the other end, and for the first time in a long time I was not trying to manage the surface of anything. The The Birchwood apartment was on the fourth floor of a building that smelled like new paint and someone else's cooking, and something I eventually identified as cedar from the closet lining. The movers arrived at 3:15, slightly behind schedule, and had everything up to the apartment by 6. I set up the lamp first, because I wanted light. I plugged it in, and it filled the room with the same warm amber glow I had known since I was 19. I stood in the middle of the mostly bare floor and looked at that light for a moment. My grandmother's lamp in my own apartment in a city she had never been to, throwing light on walls she had never seen, making the same color it had always made. It looked right where it was. It looked like it had always been there. It looked like something that belonged to the person who owned it. Then I ate the sandwich I had packed that morning and started making up the bed. 3 weeks later, Brielle drove up on a Saturday morning and texted me from the parking lot. I buzzed her in. I heard the elevator and then her knock on the door of 4C. I opened the door. She had dressed up slightly. Not formally, but more carefully than she usually dressed for a casual visit. She had on a coat I didn't recognize, which meant she had bought it herself, which was rarer than it should have been. She looked like someone who had rehearsed a version of this conversation in the car and had arrived prepared to be reasonable, which with Brielle always meant she was prepared to extract something while appearing to give something back. She looked past me into the apartment, the way people do when they're trying to catalog something quickly without looking like they're cataloging. The desk was against the far wall. The lamp was in the corner, and even from the doorway you could see it was on, throwing that amber light across the wall the way it always had. The bookshelf held my books in their original order. Everything was where I had decided to put it. None of it looked like it was waiting to be negotiated over. Brielle looked at the wall beside the entrance. On the wall, in a small wooden frame made of light birch, was the brass key. Beside it, tucked into the edge of the same frame, was the first page of my lease agreement for the Birchwood apartment. The key and the contract, side by side, in a cheap frame I had found at a market on my second weekend in the city. Brielle recognized the key immediately. She had been making jokes about it for 11 years. She knew exactly what lock it had opened. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You framed it." I said, "Yes." She looked at it for another moment. Then she said what she had come to say. She said we were family. She said she felt like I had taken too much. She said that some of those pieces had memories attached to them for her too, and that it wasn't fair to pretend that her relationship to those objects was meaningless. I listened to all of it. She spoke for about 4 minutes. She made her points clearly. Brielle was, whatever else, articulate. She could build a case for almost anything if you gave her enough time and a sympathetic audience. This apartment had neither. When she finished, I said, "I understand what you're saying." She seemed encouraged by this. She said, "So you see why I think some of it should come back. Just the pieces that meant something to both of us." I said, "Everything that's here belongs to the person who bought it." She waited. She was giving me room to soften it. I didn't. I said, "And this time the key works." I stepped back and closed the door. I stood in my hallway and listened. I heard her exhale once, long and slow. Then her footsteps going back toward the elevator. Then nothing. The lamp was on in the corner. The scratch on the desk was visible in the afternoon light. The key was on the wall where I had put it. Every silence I had ever offered in that house had been read as permission. Every smile at the right moment had become consent. I had been performing flexibility for so long that no one in that house, maybe not even me, could tell the difference between generosity and exhaustion. The cost of that was not just the objects. It was standing 6 feet away while someone wore your coat and told people you gave it to her. It was having your name on the handle of a trowel and watching someone put it in her trunk and say, "Naomi said I could." I don't regret waiting until I had the folder, the receipts, the truck, and the right moment. What I regret is how long I believed that explaining myself would ever be enough. Words give people something to argue around. Documents don't. So I want to ask you something. If you had been at that barbecue watching Brielle wear the coat with my initials sewn inside it, watching her tell the neighbors I was just too good to object, would you have said something right then? Or do you understand why I waited and did it all at once, without raising my voice?